Okay, I think I'm just going to try to finish up chapter 2 today in the lecture, and then I'll try to do a brief recording of chapter 3, and then maybe we'll have enough. You guys like bonus? Do you like bonus points? I think I'm giving away too many, though, is the problem, right? I think the grades are getting too high, and I need to kind of bring that down. No? You guys disagree with that, don't you? Okay, leave it alone? Okay. There have to be a certain number of A's, B's, C's, D's, and F's, right? Okay, no, I don't believe that. Okay, okay. So we're going to talk now about adaptations to the physical environment. And we're going to focus primarily on water and nutrients, especially the flow of water and nutrients, primarily from plants and their surroundings, and kind of how what we call osmotic potential really influences a lot of things. So there's a lot, we could talk about a lot about adaptations to the physical environment. And so when we talk about the physical environment, basically we're not talking about, dealing with, live organisms, right? So we're talking about what we call the physical environment, and that can be temperature, nutrients, water, all these sorts of things. Okay. So you look at these things, and really the most fascinating parts of adaptations to the physical environment occur in organisms that live in what I consider extreme environments. That's where you can really find these remarkable adaptations to dealing with this. What's that thing on the top? Yeah, it's a whale. Is it a sperm whale? I didn't even know. Okay. What do you think? What's weird about that thing in terms of what it has to deal with? And you can see there, it's right at the surface, right? But it's a mammal, right? Does it always stay at the surface? Nope. And in fact, it can spend an hour or more underwater at rather considerable depths where pressure is different, temperature is different, and of course there's no oxygen. Okay? So we can talk about, how do they solve that problem? And it's pretty remarkable. We're not going to talk about it, but anyway. What about these things? Penguins. Is this environment different from that environment? Okay. So they spend a lot of time between these two rather different environments. And what's this one doing? It's jumping out of the water, right? And you can, if you've ever seen this, what do they have to do to jump that high? They gain speed, and anyway, they blast out of the water. And they often come from rather extreme depths, too. And that's, depending on how deep they are, it often influences their trajectory, right? So these things are living in basically a terrestrial environment and moving into, an aquatic environment on a regular basis. This aquatic environment, in general, varies a lot more than this terrestrial environment, at least at any one particular time, right? Because you're talking about different pressures, different temperatures, different depths, and how do they deal with all those things. And of course, these are obviously air breathers too, right? Okay, so those are just kind of, okay. So one of the things we're going to be spending a lot of time looking at, and what influences a lot of in terms of sort of the organisms' responses to environmental variability, population level dynamics, or even community level dynamics, are the major nutrients that are required by organisms and how they can become limiting and how that influences population viability, population growth, and all these sorts of things. And these are what we consider some of the major nutrients that are required by organisms, and these are kind of at the top, and probably some of the more critical ones in terms of nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur, potassium, calcium. All these things are important components of essential things such as proteins and nucleic acids. These are solutes, all these sorts of things. So it is getting access to these kinds of essential nutrients that is often the thing that limits organismal responses, population growth, and all these sorts of things. So we'll be spending, this is just to kind of introduce some of these things. And you can imagine, you think nitrogen is always widely available in all parts of where an organism lives. It might be limited. at certain times of the year. It might be super abundant at certain times of the year. It may be in certain parts of where they live. It's fairly common. Other places it's fairly rare. And you can imagine all these sorts of things, and whether they're in plants or whatever they are, that's the source of where they're getting those, right? These are probably going to be, you can imagine, objects of competition between individuals. Getting access to these limiting major nutrients is often how organisms compete with one another or with other species over these resources that have these essential nutrients. Okay, obviously, soils can influence the availability of these nutrients, especially they're mostly in water, okay? So often these essential inorganic nutrients, and we're just going to focus on like ammonium, nitrate, these are the sources of nitrogen, phosphorus, calcium, and potassium, and we'll eventually towards the end of the semester talk about nitrogen cycles, phosphorus cycles, and how these things cycle at a global level. And this is an important thing to also know. Okay, so I think this is kind of a stupid slide, but anyway, it illustrates something, I guess. So here you have something, this is coarse sand, right? This is something that surrounds it. These represents kind of the pores between these coarse sand, and then you have this other kind of soil that's more silty. Soils that have more clay, right? Here's the clay, and they have this sort of silt and every sorts of things, right? You can imagine if you've ever been a gardener, right, and you have kind of coarse sand, and you pour water on it, what happens? It drains right through, right? If you have more sort of soils with more clay, silt, more organic materials and those sorts of things, the water doesn't drain as quickly, right? And obviously this can influence the ability of plants, right, that have their roots in these soils, the availability of these essential nutrients, right? So what do you think is the more troubling part? What's the more troubling part of a soil? Which of these two soils is more troubling to a plant in terms of trying to deal with getting nutrients? Yeah, the coarse sand, because you're leaching that water quickly with all the nutrients. And so these nutrients might be much more limiting in this kind of soil compared to this. And it's really easy to find. You can find places that have coarse sand, silty, organic rich soils pretty close to one another, and you look at the plant communities and they're often very different, right? You go to the sand dunes of, Florida, right? And you can find their plants are often sparse. There are only particular kinds of plants that live there. And so the porosity of soils really has a major influence on the availability of inorganic nutrients. So let's now focus just a little on this fundamental problem that all organisms have to deal with because it's a basic process. So what we're doing is we're characterizing, this is just to illustrate, here's a container, right? That has solutes in it, okay? So the way to think about this, imagine this is a plant root, okay? It's a flask, but imagine this is a plant root, and inside of it, it's in a water solution, and there's solutes in it. It can be nitrogen, phosphorus, calcium, doesn't matter what it is, right? And what you can see is, because the solutes, where's the higher concentration of solutes across that barrier, which is the flask or the root? Yeah, you have much higher concentrations of solutes here. The way this is pictured, you have no solutes in the water surrounding it, okay? So what happens through osmotic pressure? What's the movement of water when you have a concentration gradient? You guys talk about this. Tell me you talk about this in physics, don't you? Huh? Okay, you talk about biology. Okay. But the actual mechanism and why it occurs, do you talk about it in? Yeah. Okay. So what happens here, and we're not going to go into all the detail, you have this osmotic pressure, right? And assuming this is a semi-permeable membrane, it's not a flask, right? But a root, is a semi-permeable membrane, and it can suck up water, right? So what happens is, if you have this kind of gradient, then water is naturally going to move across that barrier into that higher concentration, okay? And the outcome is pretty simple. Within the funnel, the increasing volume, you're basically pushing that water up this direction, right? And what's happening to the concentration of the solute in general as that water goes in there? It's going down, right? Okay? So eventually the osmotic pressure of the fluid, which decreases the solids, become more reduced, balanced by the gravity, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so we don't have to worry too much about that. So basically, this is a common process. It always happens, right, that water moves in the direction of higher solute concentration, and that's inevitable. There's no way to get around it. There are ways to try to deal with that problem, though. And here, this of course, is a very important process. That gravitational pressure and that movement up, right, is important in plants, right? So here you have the root. Here are the root hairs. Here's the root xylem, right? Water moves into the root by osmosis, right? That osmotic pressure. You have that gradient, and water is going to go into that higher solute concentration within the root. The water, blah, 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 in the root, moves up the stem, and then tension pulls the water column upward. And this is how you move water through a plant. And where does the water need to go? It needs to go to the leaves, right, for photosynthesis, right? And of course, this is a very important thing, and then eventually you can often use the water evaporates from the cells, it cuts through, and the water vapor diffuses. So it can kind of diffuse, evaporates from the cells, but it also can go out these stomates, and you can lose the water that way, okay? So tension pulls the water column upward and outward in the xylem, and that's how you get the water movement of plants through this simple through osmosis. Okay. What do you think of this guy? Do you like it? I like his socks. Huh? I think this was taken in the 60s, or maybe mid 70s, early 80s. Okay, but anyway, here's a field biologist. He's out in the middle of a mangrove forest. Mangroves are all over Florida. They're all over tropical ecosystems. They are about the only plants that do well in. They're associated with the coast, but they're right along the coast. There's a lot of marine tidal influence into them. This is during low tide, right? But during high tide, they're completely inundated by high salinity marine waters. And you can imagine that creates a problem. So what's different about that than the thing I just showed you, which was fresh water, in terms of that osmotic gradient? Yeah. So what's going to happen there is, depending on, just generally, if the mangroves didn't do something unique, where would that water go? Would it go into the plant or out of the plant? It'd go out of the plant through that osmotic pressure. So the fundamental thing that all sorts of plants, and most plants have not been successful in dealing with it, these sort of kind of terrestrial plants, they can't deal with that high salinity because they tend to lose water through the root system, okay? So mangroves live in these high salinity environments, and there's a high osmotic potential of salt water. That means the gradient is much higher outside the root, so water's going to go out of them. So they're going to lose water. That's not good for a plant, is it? Can't survive as a plant. So it causes the high potential loss of water from roots, and it's hard to prevent water loss. Well, it turns out what these things do, what mangroves do, the unique adaptation they had, and it's in all mangroves, and the details are not important, but what they do is they actually maintain a very high concentration of solutes in the roots. So they move a lot of solutes, and I think it's magnesium. I can't remember what solute it is. I can't remember which, it might be, I don't know. I can't remember which solute it is, but what they do is they maintain a really high concentration of solutes in the root. And that now where does water go? Right. The problem is then the water goes in there, and then they have to continually keep producing this excess solute to maintain that high osmotic potential in the root, okay? So they maintain this high concentration in roots to draw in water, okay? This is what's called, even though this plant is surrounded by water, during high tide at least, this is what's called an osmotic desert. It's like a desert plant, right? It has to do things to get water because of that problem of the water always wanting to move outside of the root. And so they have this adaptation, a mechanism to produce high levels of solutes, especially down in these root systems, okay? Well, what happens then? Then there's a problem. They get a lot, as that water goes up that system, guess what it's carrying a lot with it? A lot of salt, right? So I guess it's sodium and calcium, right? So the problem is these leaves up in here, right, now have a highly salty environment, right? You know what they do to get rid of it? This is actually, I think, on the undersides mostly of the leaves. They actually excrete the salt on the underside of the leaves, okay, to get rid of that excess salt, okay? So these are the only plants that have successfully, for the most part, mangroves, and these are really important sort of various species all throughout the tropics, subtropics, in these kinds of ecosystems. And the only way they've been able to colonize and dominate these tidal ecosystems as a plant is through that unique mechanism. And there's actually, how they do it is even more fascinating. Okay. Oh, I'm done. Okay. So what I'll do, I'm tired. You're tired of listening to me. So I'm just going to I'll do a quick 15-minute video, right, on this chapter. It's pretty straightforward. This is a pretty straightforward one. It's kind of cool. And one of the things at the end is I'm going to be presenting to you the, I'll say, what I consider and most climate scientists consider indisputable levels of carbon dioxide changes over the past 300,000 years, okay? And how that's changed as a function of the Industrial Revolution and why we think this is the rate at which carbon dioxide is accumulating in our atmosphere is accelerating at a rate well above normal. So that's probably what I'll ask you to think about in the bonus point question at the beginning of class. Okay. So I'll have the exams back. Definitely Tuesday. I'll probably post the grades on Moodle sometime tomorrow. And remember, if you want to do the inquisitive, you don't have to. It's due by 11:59 p.m. tonight. And I'll be, up at 11:59 shutting it down if you don't answer it. Or do you think I might just look in the morning? I won't be up at 11:59. Okay. Okay. Homework? Let's go ahead and turn in the homework. Oh, yeah, iClicker. Sorry. Oh, geez. iClicker.